Thank you, Eckhart. So thanks everybody for your patience. Yeah, so I've kind of tried to compress this into some key ideas to share with you all. And this is sort of very much a reflection of my own thinking over the years. My interest is very much in social welfare action and social policy, understood not just in terms of welfare services and the provision of services to vulnerable groups, but also understood as a political arena for constructing notions of social citizenship, if you like, but certainly notions of duty and obligation, belonging and identity within a shared community, above all where resources are shared and there are interdependencies across members of the community. So in that sense, my interest is very practical and hence the...
Sorry to interrupt again, Rana. Dr. Rami, could you please unmute for the Arabic translation? Thank you.
Okay, and so the interest that I've taken on religion has been very much from a practical perspective in terms of how religion fits in with social policy, both in terms of its historical development, but also in terms of how the institutions operate in the contemporary period. And really, in many ways, very humbly I would say this, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who would claim this, is that the history of social policy and welfare development, and of course by connection, state development across the world has been muted to a certain extent in terms of how religion has interacted, how religious values and institutions and actors have interacted with issues of social welfare and well-being. And of course, today, our context is more the international development arena. And I'm sure you don't need me to state the obvious, but there are clear interconnections between the concerns of social policy that are in relation to social justice or poverty reduction, and also in relation to international development. So the slides and what I would like to share with you is a broad overview of some key ideas, really supporting the importance of comparative research between Islam or across religions, and both theoretically and empirically, and not thinking about Islam or the Islamic world or the Arab world to a certain extent, because they are connected, if you like, as exceptional, but rather that comparative research can help us understand the dynamics of the role of religion within social welfare action and development more broadly. So thank you very much again for giving me the space to share some of these ideas. Just before I continue, I won't sort of spend too long here, but please do take time to have a look at the MENASP network website. This network has developed since the late 2012, and the idea is to provide an open space for the discussion of social policy issues broadly defined in the Middle East. And of course, religion and religious welfare are part of this, so you may wish to follow some of our activities and perhaps contribute with us in the future. Thanks again for that. So Eckhart, is it okay for me to move the slides? Or will you?
Yes, if you have the controls, then please go ahead. Otherwise, I can do it for you.
Yeah, I'll try. I can move the cursor. I can see where you've put it. Okay, so please let me know if I run over time. I'll try to stick within the time constraint.
We have time, Rana.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so just to situate myself briefly in terms of the interests and areas I've worked in, I've looked primarily at social policy issues, as I've said at the beginning, in the Middle East, and at the beginning, the religion and Islamic welfare were very much part of this. So looking at them in conjunction and thinking about how institutional configurations of social policy accommodate or reject or work with religious actors and institutions in the MENA region, focusing primarily, as I said at the beginning, at the case study of Lebanon, which was accessible to me, but extending this to other parts of the world, and hence where eventually a collaboration in Iran with Dr. Ali, who was, you will hear his recording later on, but we were able to extend some of these collaborations to other countries and think comparatively about the dynamics of religion within civil society or within the state sector. And social policy issues dominate more now, but the interest in religion continues. And certainly I will point to a recent collaboration with colleagues Daniel Belland at the McGill University and Emanuele Povelloni at the Macerata University in Italy, where we explore in a special issue published in Journal of Social Policy and Society, the connections between religion, populism, and social policy. And there again, we deal with Islam and the ways in which there are convergences or divergences across historical regions. So just to say that the work extends and expands, and hopefully you will all have a chance to share some thoughts as well around these ideas. So as you can see, the interest in faith-based research has been paramount, and outside of the Middle East or the Islamic context, if you like, I've looked in depth at the UK, and of course that has led to more comparative work across Europe and sort of understanding the history of the development of religion and how it has influenced welfare state development. And as I was saying at the beginning, that a lot of these, this literature was quite dormant in the last few decades, and it's great to see that there is more interest in the contemporary context. And then the final sort of key area of interest, which is sort of points to my very practical concerns, is this notion of policy change. I don't use this lightly, and I'm not claiming that I have the solution to policy change, but certainly interested in the dynamics of policy making in the MENA region primarily. But again, it's important to continue to factor Islamic actors and institutions as part of the political context and bargaining or negotiation, and of course, conflict and cooperation, and trying to understand these processes more, and to therefore recognize the political agency of policy actors in the MENA region. Yeah, we will have perhaps it's easy to assume that policy decisions, whether they are development or social policy oriented, will be heavily influenced by the donor community and international development paradigms. And of course, that's sensible and that's fair, but I'm increasingly interested and sort of support the idea of studying the agency of policymakers within the local context, and to try to see how they accommodate and work with these international forces. Okay, so I'm not able to move the slides, Eckhart. I'm sorry, I'll have to rely on you. Thank you so much. So just as a general geographic overview of what we're looking at when we are referring to the Islamic world, as I'm sure already a lot of you already know, and according to Pew Research Forum, Islam is the second largest global religion. Yeah, so quite a vast population. And of course, this particular map doesn't highlight the presence of substantial Muslim communities within Western Europe and North America, yeah, or across the rest of the world. So certainly when we talk about Islam or we talk about religion, it's important to remember that there are diaspora communities or native communities as well that adhere to these religious faiths. I will primarily refer to Islam in this presentation, but of course, wherever possible, I will also bring in other religious perspectives. So thank you. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Okay, and just as a sort of a background context, when we're referring to the Islamic world or Muslim populations, we are generally, unfortunately, making some associations between geopolitical conflict or countries in political crisis, and to a certain extent, countries where in relation to their social policy formulation or their development policies, there is a sense in which there is a management of crises, whether it's outright conflict or whether it's emergency situations or lack of resources. And certainly the pandemic has brought these issues more to the fore. The idea that whereas before I was referring to how can we enhance policy agency and policy change, we are referring more to a region where crisis management and a reactive form of policy making seems to preside. And certainly when we are thinking about social policy issues, and I'll come to the definition of social policy in a couple more slides, and we can think about the connections with development more widely. There is this influence of the politicization of welfare, that political orientations are really dominate in terms of the decision making. So a classic example would be that public services or benefits would be allocated to particular communities to a certain extent because they will be given in exchange for political support for a specific political leader or party, for example. That has been an important leitmotif of this literature, yeah, going back even to the post-independence era, that there was a sense in which social welfare or social insurance benefits were there to alleviate political contention and to stop political contention. As I said earlier, we also have the unfortunate connection, perhaps certainly more in the Western media sometimes, but perhaps globally, that this connection with Islam being a religion of violence. Yeah. So therefore, where does that leave the bigger question around how we engage in questions of development or questions of social welfare? Yeah. So there is this background fear as well, or concern about this particular religion. Of course, I won't go into the depths of that now in the conversation now, but certainly just highlighting the context that we are in, especially if we're trying to understand the connections with a wider development force. And of course, the point that I referred to earlier about a sense of exceptionalism of the Islamic religion or the Muslim world. And hence I go back to my emphasis on the need for comparative research, whether this is in social science or the theorization of the politics of the Middle East or the Islamic world more widely, that we need to support this comparative perspective in order to better understand and to understand the similarities across regions and religions. Thank you. Next slide, please. So as a sort of overview, the slides will look at conceptual issues, what social policy means, where the Islamic world fits into this, the political processes and identities that have fed into this. And to a certain extent, as you may guess, I sort of take a critical stance on these concepts and sort of trying to unearth hidden or silenced perspectives. So I will refer to implicit or explicit forms of religion or religious expression in social policy. And I would say that to a certain extent, the same would happen with economic development issues or social development issues. I would also emphasize the comparisons across world religions. And for myself, I think the study of the United Kingdom and later on by extension of Europe was extremely insightful in getting a broader picture of how dynamic a force religion has been historically in all societies. And I do support this wider perspective, as I've already said. Thank you. So just as a recap of some key concepts that we're dealing with, the sort of big names and the sociology of religion and social sciences have emphasized the importance of religion as a concept that's very difficult to define, that is historically and politically contingent. And we see this across different epochs and different societies, because there is this dynamic interaction between text and context. Yeah, so we kind of go back to this idea that like any religion, Islam or Christianity or Judaism or all our major world religions have different configurations. And rather than speaking in a homogeneous manner about any religion, I would fully support, as I'm sure a lot of colleagues already do, support the idea of there being multiple forms of a religion and multiple manifestations of a particular religion. And I would certainly support this in the discussion around Islam. And of course, all of these traditions are informed by deep concepts related to philanthropy or religious social welfare action, which I will review a little bit more closely in this presentation. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. And going to the concept of social policy that I work with, and I think there's been a lot of rapprochement between social policy and development studies in the last decade. Certainly we see that in the UK amongst social policy scholars and international development scholars, and I'm keen to hear what other colleagues think. At a very basic level, one can argue that social policy shares with international development similar concerns around poverty reduction, social justice. Yeah, so we're all aiming for similar things. However, this is being done in different ways. Yeah, so international development traditionally is happening through an international donor and foreign aid system, whereas social policy has been a set of policies or a system of government that has developed more organically, and that is because of its stronger connections with the welfare state literature, which I'll come to in a second. And in that sense, social policy might differ, if you like, because its interest is in the institutional interactions amongst the state, the market, the family, the community, and the idea being very basically that the extent to which a citizen depends on either one of these actors for their welfare or their well-being, so to access jobs, to access their healthcare services, access education, will put them at particular points of advantage or disadvantage in society. And the traditional view, as I'm sure colleagues will be familiar with, is that a stronger state role will promote this sort of wider experience of equity and egalitarianism within a society. I've worked with the social policy concept myself because I found that it allows me to understand the local context within and the domestic politics of welfare, but without negating the influence of international development actors. And in that sense, it's allowed me to focus on institutional and political analysis without sort of the pressure of thinking about questions of economic development or particular forms of policy that might lead to social justice. And in that sense, as you can see there, the quote by Peter Townsend, the well-known theorist and a thinker of social policy within the UK context, all societies have social policies. So we shouldn't be restricted by the connection with the welfare state of Western Europe. And hence, what I said at the beginning, I find it helpful when we are thinking about social welfare, development, social justice issues, and certainly the role of religion within this, to think about these two key concepts of who is delivering services at a very basic level. And here there is a focus on vulnerable groups. And we do see this a lot, both from within the policymaking community or within the literature. Yeah, there is quite a healthy literature around charity and philanthropy, primarily by North American writers in relation to Islam and all world religions. Yeah, so there is a long history of research around services to vulnerable groups, so filling a gap or reaching populations that are difficult to reach. There's all kinds of rationales for this. What there is less emphasis on is this political process of actually accessing those services. Yeah, on what basis is a vulnerable person defined as vulnerable, and are they excluded from a system? Are they vulnerable because there is some kind of male breadwinner model in that society, which automatically means that they will not be able to access the social insurance services within that country? Yeah, so, and I think this is where perhaps there is potential for more dialogue between social policy and international development discourse, that we are bringing in more directly the agency of the local partners and policymakers and civil society groups, so within the countries that we might be working in, and recognizing their interaction within a wider process, even if they are in receipt of the ideas from a global elite, if you like, or in receipt of the funding. I think it's important to recognize their agency as well. And so in that sense, I found social policy to be a helpful concept to work with, because it allows this analysis of what services are delivered and to whom, but then it asks the bigger question about the how. So the basis upon which organizations come to have this role. And of course, the work that was done in Lebanon, and of course, later on within the UK context, was very curious about the origins of this activity and where it began. And that's an interesting history that I'm afraid I can't go into detail here, but certainly is important for understanding the institutional dynamics of religion within a wider social policy and development context. Thank you. Next slide, please. And so in that sense, religion and social policy, there is this question in the literature about which came first, one could argue, and there's a whole host of interesting references of which began first, if you like, and that in some ways religion already had the seeds of community and charity and philanthropic activity, as you can see there in the Christian faith. One might refer to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Perhaps, obviously, I'm speaking from the British context, and my colleagues might want to correct or add to this. There is, of course, the principle of the Christian tithe as well. So the idea of paying a charitable amount, which has disappeared perhaps, but there's still, collections that happen in churches or in various communities. We have a big emphasis on food banks now. And certainly food banks depend on donations as well. In the Dharmic faiths, Hinduism, Sikhism, we have the concept of selfless service, so the sewa. In Islam, as colleagues may already know, there is the idea of the zakat being a pillar of Islam, and of course, various Quranic sayings or prophetic sayings encouraging philanthropy or encouraging sort of community solidarity. And of course, in Judaism, amongst other concepts, there is the concept of the tzedakah, which also refers to almsgiving for the vulnerable. Yeah, so we have these connections across all religions in terms of this interest in helping or supporting others. Thank you. Next slide. And so I'm going to sort of begin to sort of share these big ideas. And I think for me, the curiosity always was, and sort of going back to the early 2000s about why we weren't referring to the role of religion more widely within MENA societies, which was the context I was working in, and then sort of comparing that with the Western scholarship and the discourse that I obviously was located in, and trying to understand why we have these different perspectives. Yeah, why are we more likely to think negatively about the role of religion in the MENA context, and perhaps completely sideline or forget the role of religion equally within the social welfare context within the UK, which was the context that I was in. And of course, I know experiences vary with continental Europe, but just from the scholarship point of view, is that why were there these discrepancies? And I've just got a couple of quotes for you here. This is just a sort of Alain de Botton, a columnist and a sort of philosopher within the UK context, who talks about the long-standing influence of the Judeo-Christian values of charity, serenity, love on Western society, versus perhaps what we might know today as the more capitalist values, if you like, of success and wealth and individual glory, and that there is this tension. And of course, the welfare state development within Western Europe has sort of epitomized this tension between altruism and individualism, yeah, and how we deal with the capitalist system. So there was recognition of some of these ideas in the Western discourse. Thank you. Next slide. And as you can see, the opposite. So another sort of quite prominent sociologist of religion in the United States, Philip Gorski, who sort of really depicted, if you like, this dualism within social science scholarship, that we tended to think of religion more in the third world as being a result of a marriage of positivism and postmodernism, in which cultural relativism serves as cover for a deep-seated modernism that still sees religion as a symptom of backwardness. Yeah, so just highlighting this imbalance within the literature about viewing religion as something backward and not so positive within low and middle income countries. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have historical accounts within the Western context. And again, here I'm citing the UK context, where in some historical accounts that were quite sort of neglected within contemporary social policy scholarship, as you can see from the long quote there, that within the UK, these ideas around the role of religion were being neglected. Yeah, and to a certain extent, European literature has perhaps better acknowledged the role of religion, perhaps due to the Catholic influence as well. But again, the UK context had to learn from this. So thank you. Next slide. And again, we have a reference, very rare references. Yeah, these are sort of really very few and far between references to the role of religion in the development of social policy and welfare systems. And here there is a reference to Christian socialism and the idea that this is sort of not always recognized, but some would argue that the roots of the welfare system of Britain certainly are very much located within the Christian socialist traditions of the 19th century. And of course, there is a competing view that actually the welfare system is located within a more socialist or social democratic system. But this tension does exist. And I think that our common interest around the role of religion in development helps to bring these ideas more to the fore and to recognize them as important for both scholarship and policy making. Thank you. Next slide, please. And of course, in the press, and I won't spend too much time on this, but there is recognition that church groups and religious groups, and this is again thinking about the Western context, have the ability to reach populations that are hard to reach, but also have the ability to build relationships, yeah? In contrast to political and welfare state systems that tend to be impersonal and bureaucratic, if you like, these church communities continue to have that force even within the Western context. Thank you. Next slide, please. And perhaps the best advocate politically of these ideas was Mr. Tony Blair, who was the previous Prime Minister under the new Labour government in the early sort of the 2000s decade. And he, of course, as a lot of you may know, was extremely active in promoting the argument that religion actually informed a lot of the contemporary democratic values that Western societies have, and that they continue to have a role within the promotion of issues like human worth, dignity, law, and democracy. And as we know, he became quite a forceful or a active supporter of the role of religion within development more broadly. So a sense in which these debates have developed, if you like, leading us to the contemporary context that we are in. And of course, formal recognition. I mean, certainly the 2000s was such an interesting time to study the re-entry of religion into the policy arena and sort of the increasingly faith-friendly politics of the UK, I know certainly, but wider discourse. So as colleagues were mentioning earlier, the World Bank began to embrace the role of faith communities and of course the UN. So we are now at the point where we are revisiting these debates. Thank you. Next slide, please. So just as a kind of a reminder, because the makeup of these religious groups varies, and I think this is where in a moment we'll begin to think a bit more about the comparisons and the contrasts with the Islamic world. And in the Western context, we tend to find faith groups providing support in niche areas, filling in the gaps for the state. So there might be specific services in terms of education, and they may have their own faith schools. There may also be health support services related to mental health or or general well-being. There might also be a lot of activity in urban renewal and community regeneration projects, and these have been quite popular. So these faith groups tend to operate within their local communities, and they very much rely on their relationships within the local areas that they work in. And in that sense, there's a very important commonality with some of the civil society faith groups as well that we see in the MENA region or some Islamic countries as well. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so I think, yeah, this is one of the slides I cut out when I tidied up my slides. So if it's all right, we can skip this. Thank you so much. So yeah, so emphasizing local and community level support, emphasizing the personalized service and tight-knit relations that faith groups tend to have within the communities that they operate in and provide services to. Homogeneous constituents, that these communities tend to share similar faith, the similar faith. So, and this exists across the UK context, certainly, and I'm highlighting it because these are also characteristics that we find in the MENA countries as well, where these organizations operate at local community level. They tend to have this very strong community identity and a very strong connection with the local population that they are with. But there is this holistic approach, which is shared on beliefs and values and having this common identity, and therefore a concern with protecting the heritage or leaving a legacy. So these are not necessarily concerns of a policy stakeholder, for example, but this idea of protecting identity and protecting shared values, I would say, is part and parcel of the welfare activity, excuse me, and development activity that religious organizations would be involved in. Thank you. Next slide. So coming to think about the Islamic context and thinking about MENA countries, the history is different, yeah, whereas in the Western context, this religion was clearly a very important force that gradually was squeezed out by the rise of the secular state, and the church sort of had developed a kind of a niche role for itself as supplementary to the state. Within the Islamic context, the situation, as I'm sure colleagues will know, has been quite different, and that there has been a lot more political interaction between Islamic or religious groups, but perhaps not so we don't confuse things. I think the emphasis needs to be on Islamic groups because they have been the more numerous ones and the more involved in the political systems of the countries. Of course, Lebanon is slightly different, and I'm very happy to discuss Lebanon in a bit more detail at some point, perhaps in the Q&A, but I'll just speak in general terms here and refer to Lebanon where possible. So on the one hand, there is this concern with the Islamic revival, yeah, with the backlash that has happened in the last couple of decades, and certainly the roots of this, some would argue, lie in the post-independence era, where by the 60s and 70s, there was a sense in which the modernization project of post-independence state in the MENA region had failed to provide for all of the population, had failed to share the benefits of modernization, and therefore Islam increasingly began to be seen as a source of a new form of sort of anti-modern understanding of the world, and therefore in some respects certain social groups began to react against the state by providing education, healthcare, income transfers, and basic public work. So there is first a story of modernization that had gone wrong, yeah, in explaining the entry of Islamic organizations into the public arena. There is also, as part of that, a story around economic growth that has been imbalanced in the MENA region. You will know from international development discourses, they will often refer to imbalanced jobless growth, if you like, and we know of the high levels of unemployment and growing numbers of the middle classes unable to find jobs, and these have been seen as actors who have been attracted to a stronger Islamic identity, with this idea of Islam being the solution. And so this has led to a range of religious welfare organizations developing political agendas of their own and trying to present alternative visions of society, if you like. Perhaps this perspective was a lot more dominant in previous times. However, there's a sense in which this is still quite valid for the context that we are in. Thank you. Next slide. Yeah, so as you can see, there were some typos that I corrected, yeah, but we're using the older version. I do apologize. So I think in some respects, therefore, oh, I'm sorry, Eckhard, would you mind going to the slide after? Because that's the one that follows. Yeah, thank you. Then we'll have to go back to the top one. I do apologize. So, so in that sense, when we begin to think about the concept of social welfare, I have argued this, and obviously this is open to debate, but certainly the way in which the key Islamic welfare organizations that are affiliated to the important political groups in the region, so I'm mentioning two here, social welfare provision, and obviously one can argue about the overlaps between social welfare and development. This is fundamental to the identity of these political groups, that in some respects, their discourse has been built around the idea that they themselves are social movements that are supporting the identity and the rights of disenfranchised populations. Yes, so in the case of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, there is the argument that the Shia population was uneducated and historically excluded and poor, and therefore they represent the revival of this particular community, and therefore providing social welfare benefits was a key part of this activity. And so in that sense, the discourse of social justice and human ethics is key to these organizations. Now, we obviously referred to questions of conflict. It is important to mention that conflict doesn't exist in all of these contexts. So in some Middle Eastern countries, there is accommodation between the religious welfare organizations and the state. So I highlight here two examples of Lebanon and Iran, if you like. In the Lebanese context, the sectarian system means that the political system operates through a contracting out or a subcontracting type of relationship between the state and social welfare organizations. So specifically, the Ministry of Social Affairs in Lebanon subsidizes institutional care and social care and education for orphan children or children from poor households. And these services are provided through the faith-based organizations. And in fact, in Lebanon, the majority of organizations providing social care services are of a religious profile. Yeah, so this is quite key to how some of these countries work. And of course, in Iran, there is a sense in which there are major sort of parastate welfare organizations that act on behalf of the state to provide services. Thank you. Eckhart, I'll trouble you to go back to the top slide if you don't mind, the one before. Yes, sorry. And here I just want to highlight just therefore this perspective that that Islam, like any religion, operates in both implicit and explicit forms within the social policy context, yeah, within the provision of services. On the one hand, we have religious welfare charities and we have outright Islamic movements, but I think this was particular in the case of Lebanon, but I would say it exists across the MENA countries, is that there is also a tradition of family-based charity or philanthropic activity. And here, the staff members, the directors, the actual organization itself may not be composed of clerics or may not be made up of a homogeneous religious group. However, there are religious values, if you like, pertaining to the role of the family, the protection of children, to the role of charity. And in that sense, the religious influence can operate in a more implicit form within these family-based charities and philanthropic organizations. And in that sense, What's developed, therefore, is an emphasis on a social safety net approach and a focus on vulnerable groups within a lot of the MENA countries. And perhaps paradoxically, rather than religion promoting perhaps a greater sense of the public good, and I think this is the tension that we need to deal with when we are addressing these bigger questions about development and social policy, is to what extent is this, this really active and dynamic religious welfare activity, to what extent is it promoting a sense of the public good rather than a parochial delivery of services according to a specific sect or according to a particular community. And here, I think it's helpful to highlight the role of the waqf and the role of the zakat. There is a lot of enthusiasm about the zakat. And of course, a lot of countries that have a sort of a dynamic Muslim population or an Islamic state operate a formal system of zakat. And that's all well and good. What's often the case is that this zakat might well be collected and it's not really monitored in terms of how it's spent, even if it's spent through state agencies. Yeah. And of course, a lot more can be said about the zakat, but in some ways, one could argue it operates as a form of charity. And of course, it operates in quite informal ways as well. So in some countries that have the Shia, and sorry to speak in these Shia terms or Sunni terms, but sometimes the variations do apply in the context. Countries that have the khumus, the fifth, might prefer for this to be paid in informal ways and directly to the mosques rather than be collected by the state. And that's all well and good, but I would actually argue that the more interesting concept is the waqf. And as you can see there, the definition is of a religious endowment where the donor gives away some of his or her wealth for public benefit and determines the purpose and beneficiaries of the endowment. And this is a definition that I've also borrowed from a UNESCO report. So just to be upfront about this, but the waqf generally is known that this is a religious endowment in perpetuity, and it's given for public good and public use. There's a very interesting literature about the history of the waqfs up until the colonial era. And certainly within the Turkish context, there's been very interesting work done by Engin Aysin at the Open University around how the waqf in Turkey in the 18th and 19th century helped to promote social and economic development and helped to promote a sense of social citizenship and public good, because often it was a way for a rich family or an individual with capacity and access to particular resources, it could be land, it could be a building, to dedicate that to public use. And of course, waqf, there are waqf ministries now in a lot of the MENA countries. So, and all the religious groups have these this property that they own. And I would just point towards this as, because historically it has played a key part in economic and social development and development of notions of social citizenship within countries where Muslims have been the important population, but also in other religions. So in Lebanon, the Christian communities have their waqfs and the Druze communities have theirs as well. And I would just point to the importance of conducting further research on the waqfs, because they tend to be sidelined in relation to the concept of zakat. Thank you. So next slide, there's two, yes, thank you. Are we doing all right for time, Eckhart? Just, I can try and wrap up soon.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So here I just want to highlight some of the distinctions across the world, if you like, going back to this concept of Islamic welfare and its implicit and explicit forms. And here there is the example of the Emdad community in the Lebanon, the committee in the Lebanon, which is which has charitable status, but is politically affiliated to Hezbollah as a political organization. And what's interesting about the Emdad committee is that it was also established, it has a mother organization, if you like, in Iran that was established by the Khomeini. It operates independently in Lebanon, but it sort of has this ideological connection, if you like, to Lebanon, to Iran, and operates within its own communities. And therefore, in that sense, there is a separation in that this is an organization that works with vulnerable groups and poor communities rather than directly with the military wing of the organization that it belongs to. Yeah. Obviously, we can discuss that further in the Q&A, but equally, you've got, as a comparison, quite a different view from the UK, going back, therefore, to this comparative perspective of Islamic Relief, which is an organization, I believe its headquarters are in Birmingham in the UK, but operates as an international NGO. Yeah, so you have these different visions of how Islam operates within the social welfare or international development arena that's very much sort of dictated or determined by the local geographical and historical context within which they operate. Thank you. Next slide, please. So there are some bigger questions, and I've kind of looked at these in the past in some of my previous work, and happy to explore these ideas further with you. And I think that certainly this remains a conundrum. I think anyone dealing with international development issues and the role of religion, certainly in the MENA region or looking at Islamic contexts, needs to take seriously the role of the state and the extent to which the state acts in a partisan way and sort of stokes the divisions within society, or is able to provide egalitarian forms of development. And here I'm just highlighting, perhaps this, you may not agree, but this may be one of the paradoxes in the sort of the activities of international development over the decades, which is that the donor community has tried to promote a socially inclusive form of democracy, plus some kind of economic private sector-led development. And therefore, this has put the primary emphasis of the resources and the delivery of services and public services within the state, and has really sort of emphasized the role of the state within this provision. And yet, sort of the historical record of conflict within MENA countries and countries with large Muslim populations will show opposing trends, I suppose, will show conflict between the state and some religious communities. So you'll see that in Jordan, you'll see that in Egypt, perhaps to a certain extent, you'll see it also in Tunisia, in Algeria. And so we have this contention, yeah, there is this tension as well, not just contention between the state and the Islamic groups. And I think that this is a really key question for going further, yeah, going forward and thinking about how we operationalize the SDGs, is to try and understand this state-society dynamic. And I'm not saying that the religious actors are always opposed to the state. I think the lens of implicit and explicit expressions of religion is really key, and how those religious values can translate into a residual system of social policy that excludes the other, that excludes other minority religions or other political or ethnic groups, or even excludes women. Yeah, I mean, I think that the gender dimension to this is really paramount, and the extent to which women are adversely incorporated and the extent to which their rights are recognized. So these questions, I would say, are quite paramount for us going forward. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so here really I'm just sort of summing up that if we look, and I think this is my perception, that looking at different religions and different regional contexts globally, we have different means, if you like. So in the Islamic contexts, the states might use the zakat system, as I'm mentioning there. They may contract out religious charities. as in the case of Lebanon. In the case of Turkey, we have a sort of a blurring of boundaries, and the state itself increasingly over the last decade and more, taking on more of a family-focused social assistance type of understanding of social policy, and therefore a more residual approach to social policy. And these are themes that resonate across the region. But in this sense, if we are comparing to the global discourse and global activities, therefore is that the MENA countries, perhaps in that sense, are just promoting a more charity-focused or residual approach to social policy. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Sorry, can we unmute interpreter Rami, please? Sorry.
That's okay. And so going back to, and I'm sort of, as I said, summing up now and thinking back historically to how social policy systems have developed within the literature, and going back to this perspective across where social policy began. So in the Northern European post-war welfare states, where we have the handover of church welfare services to the state administration and the establishment of national churches. In the UK context, when this happened, when the transfer of services was made to the state, there was a sense in which the welfare state was actually doing the work of Jesus Christ, as it were, yeah. And sort of this was what the church, how the Church of England saw this, and how they could justify the transition of welfare provision to the state authorities. And of course, there is an extensive literature around the different paths that Protestant and Catholic countries, primarily countries adopted within the Western European context, and the extent to which they relied more on social assistance and the church having a dominant role as opposed to the state taking over. So in countries like the UK or Sweden, where there is an established national church, there was a kind of a collusion between the state and the church actors, and we could no longer see the difference between them. In some ways, I suppose it's not quite it's not a theocratic state, but certainly it's a different take on how religion became subsumed within the national political context. Thank you. Next slide. So where do we go from here? For Muslim populated countries, these are certainly very big questions. I think that first, questions of the need for a social, some colleagues refer to it, a social contract, but some cohesive vision for society is needed, and its legitimacy still is being argued out. The Sustainable Development Goals agenda is helping to push this argument forward amongst governments in the MENA region, but there is still some way to go. Given the increasing levels of conflict and the compounded effect of COVID, I think religious organizations continue to sort of do what they've always done in these countries and provide services and provide support to their local communities. But the extent to which the tensions between religious groups and the state can be alleviated is another matter. I think, if anything, in some countries, we see a tightening of legislation. So, for example, in the Egyptian context, over the last few years, there has been a tightening of civil society laws, and that sort of narrows the scope for religious actors to act. And perhaps to a certain extent, this may be happening in Jordan. Colleagues will know better. But I think that we may argue that there is potential for religious actors to be productive and positive actors within civil society and to support the state and to support political life. But it is important to think about the current context that we are in, and heightening tensions and the vulnerability to conflict, and whether this poses more of a challenge than would be ideal. So there is this balancing of the influence of also international development organizations and donor agencies with the perspective of the local players within government and civil society. And that's obviously, I'm sure a lot will be said about this during the workshop. I would also highlight some other questions, perhaps related more to the ethics of social policy. Perhaps we are at a time, and I think we see this in many quarters, because the pandemic has sort of is forcing many people to rethink how we do things, and it's magnified the inequalities of society. It is a time to revisit these ideas and to revisit the core values that bring a society together and that promote the need for egalitarian social policy systems. Thank you. I think in the old version, this might be the last. So there's one more slide. So as always, a policy-oriented research agenda, because I really promote this idea of problem solving and action. Yeah, in the end, religious organizations are doing something very practical, and the development arena is a very practical arena. Certainly, as I said at the beginning, I would greatly encourage comparative, historically sensitive research that helps to put things into perspective. And certainly when we are dealing with potentially sensitive and contentious religions like Islam, and locating this analysis within institutions and looking at the state, but looking at civil society, looking at the business sector, and looking at the family context, so thinking holistically about these issues. And that, of course, Islam, as with all other religions, has got multiple faces and multiple forms of expression, and that it's important, therefore, not to homogenize and to be sensitive to the variations across different contexts when we are thinking about Islam in a development context. And therefore, of course, that this is one religion operating in dynamic synergy with other religions and other communities. Yeah, I think important not to lose sight of these issues. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you very much. We will now have a brief Q&A, and I would ask you to type your questions in the chat. We will probably not get to all of them because one contribution that was only confirmed very, very recently is that we have a video contribution from Dr. Ali Akbar Tajmazinani, who's the editor of the volume Social Policy and Islam, basically the edited volume from where Rana contributed a chapter. And we can look at his video contribution in just a minute, but we do have time for a few questions to Professor Rana Jawad now. In the chat, please, if you like. I hope the chat functionality has been restored and everybody can chat. I see nods from my colleagues. So please go ahead and type your questions in the chat if you have any, or your comments. In the meantime, maybe a small community announcement for the lunch break. I would ask all the registered participants to, before you rejoin, look at your email. Can we allow Abdel Latif, please, to unmute for translation? Yeah, for all registered participants, I would like you to look to check your email before you rejoin after the lunch break, because we might make some adjustments to the entry procedure. So we have a question, Rana, from Stefan Pleisnitzer, who wonders if you could expand a bit more on the role of political parties in the provision of social welfare.
Thank you for the question. So political parties operating in the Middle East region? Yeah. In social welfare, yeah, that was in social welfare, not in relation to religion. Sorry, just gathering my thoughts there. So, I mean, I think so countries will vary, and the Middle East as a whole has, you know, what we would recognize as a system of social welfare or a social policy system, in that there is employment-based social insurance. Yeah, so all of these countries will have some form of social insurance provision for private sector workers who are the minority. Then there are public sector workers who will have social insurance contributions as well, that they will have in much the same way that we would recognize them, you know, in our context here. And these will operate regardless. This is part of the state system. And then there is a social assistance system that supports vulnerable groups. There might be social grants, pension schemes, cash transfer programs that target often female-headed households or children. And the extent of these varies. So probably Egypt, Morocco, to a certain extent Jordan, to a certain extent Tunisia have some quite sort of well-developed social assistance systems where they provide these cash transfers to vulnerable groups and populations that are in need. Now, where the political parties come in, and I think this varies in the extent to which different countries are vulnerable to systems of favoritism or manipulation by political actors. In the context of the Lebanon, where perhaps it may be one of the most stark examples, is that there is a power distribution system where the different leaders of the different sects effectively are equivalent to the different political parties, and they may try to lay claim on specific ministries to try to control specific government portfolios. And sometimes this may lead to providing jobs or providing benefits to members of their communities. Now, a Ministry of Social Affairs, for example, in Lebanon, does try to strike a balance in terms of the resource allocations that it gives to all of the different religious communities and religious organizations. And I think that the extent of this, you know, will vary. So I think countries will vary. Political parties as such, therefore, I think if they are able to lay claim on a particular government agency or government resources, may be able to control this better. But I think overall, what's more the case is that there is an urban versus rural preference. So I think if you live in an urban area in the Middle East, you are more likely to be able to access better quality services. If there is a connection to some political figure, then depending on the country, but there is also a greater likelihood to access health and education and other services. And that would vary. So I wouldn't say that the political parties as such, but rather these sort of political connections, if you like, and where there is a particular faction that gains control of a particular state agency. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Rana. Let me just take out one next question. Are you optimistic for future social policy and sustainable development in MENA for the next decades, and what would be the priority in this context?
Well, my sense is that it's business as usual. There are tried and tested systems that are in place now. There is a sort of a status quo, if you like. And the groups that are in place have their sources and their resources, and there is a fixed system in place now. So in that sense, on the one hand, they're able to react well to emergencies. Yeah, and you see that during the pandemic now, and whenever there is a crisis, the organizations mobilize, and they don't necessarily just provide support to their own communities. Yeah, I mean, genuinely, they will look beyond their communities if that were the case, certainly in an emergency situation. I think what's really more worrying is the compounding sort of the impacts of the pandemic with economic deterioration, and certainly the continued levels of high unemployment. I think that these will sort of potentially add more pressure to the context. And so I think the fault lines are political, and the extent to which religion is used for political purposes, I think that becomes the danger, as always. And this isn't something unique to the MENA region. Yeah, so religious identity will be mobilized in that respect. So I think that what is of concern is the current economic and the pandemic impact. But these organizations have proved, the religious organizations have proved themselves to be quite resilient. Yeah, and in that sense, they've continued. And of course, there are non-religious, and there's a very active civil society and secular civil society as well, but perhaps not more involved in advocacy work than they are involved in providing services. So yeah, so in sum, I think it's the politicization of religion, and it's the context is rife, is very fertile for additional conflict, unfortunately.
Thank you. One other question is, you mentioned a couple of times diasporas in European countries contexts. Could you comment on maybe North American or Australian Muslim diasporas?
Well, in what sense? So I'm not fully familiar with them, save for the fact that these will tend to be communities that will probably set up a community center or a religious, a mosque or a church or whichever body they adhere to, and they will tend to practice sort of community solidarity support, if you like. So I've not studied in depth Australia, I have to say, but I would say that sort of the basic knowledge that I have of beyond the European boundaries would be that the image, if you like, or the activity that these the diaspora communities will take will be to set something up locally for themselves and pool resources, and perhaps rely on each other more. They may well extend their affiliation with organizations in the home country as well, where they're connected to ideologically. But they will tend to operate at community level. I think it's also important to remember that this is very much the case for North America, and I'm sure the same for Australia, is that any diaspora community setting up a community organization or a charitable group will need to abide by the laws, by the different associational laws within those countries. And the United States has its charity laws, just as the UK, just as Australia. So I imagine these communities will need to be vetted financially, present their accounts, and they would need to operate. I mean, they will probably have their own local character, but they will still need to operate according to the laws of the land. And in that sense, they will operate as a charitable organization, and they will have that charity status quite likely.
Thank you very, very much, Rana. There's plenty of more comments, also appreciations of your presentation. Thank you ever so much. And please have a look at the chat for the comments that we didn't get to now. I would like to move on to the contribution of Ali Akbar Tajmazinani.